Okay, so I want to talk about what's really going on in this situation with Kendra Duggar and Joseph Duggar, because honestly, the more you look into it, the less it makes sense on the surface. At first, if you just go by what's being reported online, it kind of looks straightforward. You'd think they both have their own legal teams, handling things separately, doing what's best for themselves. That's the impression a lot of media coverage gives. But when you actually dig into the details, especially the information from that call, it starts to feel like that's not the full picture at all. There's this conversation where Joseph is talking about getting documents, being served papers, and going over everything with the same lawyer, Travis. And that's the part that really stands out, because if Kendra truly had her own separate attorney, then why are both of them connected to the same person handling the case? That alone raises a lot of questions. And this is where things start to get complicated, because in a situation like this, they're not in the same position legally. From what's being said, Kendra's situation is less severe compared to Joseph's. Normally, that would mean she should have her own legal strategy, something focused on protecting herself and, more importantly, her chances of getting her kids back. But if they're actually sharing a lawyer, that changes everything. It means there are limits on what can be said or done. A lawyer can't fully defend one person if it ends up hurting the other. So instead of acting in her best interests alone, Kendra could be stuck in a situation where decisions are being made that benefit both of them, or maybe even prioritize Joseph more. And then there's another layer to this that people aren't really talking about enough. There are claims that Kendra knew certain things about Joseph before they even got married, things he allegedly told her himself. If that's true, that's not a small detail. That's something that could completely change how this case is viewed. Now, think about it. If she has that kind of information, but she's tied into the same legal defense as him, is she even in a position where she can speak freely? Or is she basically being kept in a situation where staying silent is the only option? And that's where Jim Bob Duggar comes into the picture, because a lot of this starts to make more sense when you consider control. Not just control over the situation, but control over what gets said, what comes out, and what stays hidden. When you look at everything together, the shared lawyer, the public narrative not matching what's actually happening, and the possibility that Kendra knows more than she can say, it doesn't feel random. It feels organized, like there's a very specific direction this is all being pushed in. And the big question is, who is that really helping?
So when you really sit with all of this, the biggest issue here isn't just the case itself. It's how the entire situation is being handled behind the scenes. Because once you understand how shared legal representation works, you start to see why this could be a serious problem, especially for Kendra Duggar. In simple terms, when two people are using the same lawyer in a case like this, that lawyer can't fully act in one person's best interest if it hurts the other. That's just how it works. And in this situation, Kendra and Joseph Duggar are not on equal ground legally. From everything described, Joseph is facing much more serious issues, while Kendra's situation, although still serious, is different and potentially less severe. Now, normally, that difference matters a lot, because someone in Kendra's position could take a completely different legal route. She could separate herself, cooperate more, possibly even make a case that she wasn't fully aware of everything or that she was under pressure. That kind of approach could change her outcome entirely, especially when it comes to something as important as her children. But here's the problem. If she's tied to the same lawyer, those options start disappearing. Because think about it. If there was ever a moment where Kendra needed to say something that could put Joseph in a worse position, the lawyer can't guide her to do that. They're responsible for protecting both clients. So instead, what you end up with is this kind of unified defense, where both people stick to the same version of events, whether or not that actually benefits both of them equally. And that's where things start to feel less like legal strategy and more like control. Because if Kendra's best chance at protecting herself involves distancing from Joseph, even legally or personally, that path becomes extremely difficult if she's not getting independent advice. She can't be told, "This is what's best for you," if that advice directly harms him. So she's essentially locked into a situation where her decisions are tied to his outcome. And when you look at it that way, it raises a bigger question. Was this setup actually meant to help both of them, or was it designed to keep everything contained? Because there's also the issue of what Kendra may already know. According to the information, Joseph allegedly shared things with her before they got married, things that were minimized but still significant. And if that's true, then her knowledge isn't just personal, it could be legally important. Now, imagine being in that position. You know things that could matter, maybe even change how people see the situation. But at the same time, you're in a system where speaking up could go against the very defense you're tied into. That's not a simple situation, that's pressure. And it gets even more complicated when you bring in the role of Jim Bob Duggar, because from what's being described, this doesn't look like a passive situation where everyone is just making their own independent decisions. It feels structured, like there's a clear preference for keeping everything aligned, controlled, and most importantly, quiet. There's also mention of how media narratives are being shaped, articles suggesting separate legal representation, stories being picked up and repeated across outlets. It creates a version of reality that most people will accept without questioning. But if that version isn't fully accurate, then it's not just misleading, it's strategic. Because if the public believes Kendra is acting independently, then no one questions whether she actually has the freedom to do so. And that's where this starts to go beyond just legal complications. It becomes about influence, about who gets to make decisions, who gets to speak, and who doesn't. And then there's the situation with the children, because at the end of the day, that's what matters most. If the goal is reunification, then the court is going to look very closely at whether a parent can provide a safe and stable environment. And if one parent is seen as a risk, the other parent is usually expected to create distance from that risk. But again, how do you do that if you're legally and strategically tied together? If Kendra were completely independent in this, she could show the court that she's willing to take steps, make changes, and prioritize her children above everything else. That's often what courts want to see. But if she's part of a shared defense, those actions might not even be on the table. So what you're left with is a situation where her ability to prove herself could be limited, not necessarily because she doesn't want to, but because the structure around her doesn't allow it. And that's what makes this whole thing so concerning. Because when you strip everything down, this isn't just about legal charges or media narratives. It's about whether someone is being given a real chance to act in their own best interest, or whether that chance is being quietly taken away.
And when you look at everything together, this is where it starts to feel less like a legal situation that just got complicated and more like something that's being carefully managed step by step. Because think about the timing of everything. The reports that came out, the way the story was framed in the media, and then what's actually being said in private conversations. It doesn't fully line up. The public version makes it seem like things are separated and under control, but behind the scenes, it looks way more connected than people realize. And that matters because perception plays a huge role in cases like this. If people believe that Kendra Duggar is acting independently, then there's no reason to question whether she's being influenced or guided in a certain direction. But if that independence isn't real, then everything changes. Then you have to start asking whether the decisions being made are actually hers, or if they're being shaped by the people around her. And this is where the situation with the children becomes even more serious. Because once children are removed from a home and placed into care, the entire process shifts. They're no longer in that same environment. They're around new people, professionals, therapists, teachers, people who are trained to listen, observe, and document. Over time, kids start to talk. They start to describe what they've seen, what they've experienced, and what life was like before. And that's something no one can fully control anymore. So if you're looking at this from the perspective of someone trying to contain damage, that becomes a major concern. Because now the only thing left to manage isn't the children, it's the adults. It's what they say, how they respond, and whether any new information comes out from them. And that brings the focus right back to Jim Bob Duggar. Because if the idea is to keep everything consistent, then keeping people aligned becomes the priority. Keeping them on the same legal path, the same story, the same defense. Because the moment that breaks, if one person steps away, speaks differently, or reveals something new, it changes everything. And that's why the shared lawyer situation becomes such a big deal again. Because it doesn't just affect legal strategy, it affects what's even possible. If Kendra were to suddenly decide, I need to do something different, I need my own representation, I need to focus on my kids and my future, that would completely shift the direction of this case. It could open the door for her to explain her side more freely, to separate herself legally, and to take steps that show the court she's acting independently. But staying in a shared defense makes that kind of move a lot harder. And then there's something else that stands out here. The idea of pressure, even if it's not always obvious. Because pressure doesn't always look like force. Sometimes it looks like support, financial help, housing, emotional reassurance, being told this is the best thing for you. And when you're in a situation where everything in your life is connected to the same group of people, it becomes really hard to go against that. So even if there is a way out, it might not feel like one. And that's why people are so divided when they look at this situation. On one side, there are those who feel like Kendra should take responsibility, step away, and do whatever it takes to protect her children. And that's a completely valid perspective, because at the end of the day, the kids come first. But on the other side, there's also the reality that she may be in a position where making that kind of decision isn't as simple as it sounds, where every option comes with consequences, and where the path that looks right from the outside feels almost impossible from the inside. And that tension, that back and forth, is what makes this situation so complicated, because it's not just about what's right or wrong, it's about what's possible. And right now, everything about this case suggests that the options available to her may not be as open as they appear.
And when you step back and look at everything as a whole, it really comes down to one thing: choices. Not just the choices that have already been made, but the ones that still can be made from this point forward. Because despite everything, the shared legal situation, the pressure, the public narrative, there's still a line where things can go one way or the other. And that line, right now, seems to sit directly in front of Kendra Duggar. The reality is, cases like this don't stay controlled forever. Information comes out, details get clarified, people start speaking, whether it's through legal processes, investigations, or even just over time as situations change. What might feel contained today doesn't always stay that way, and that's especially true here, because there are multiple directions this could go. If everything continues the way it is, same legal strategy, same alignment, same silence, then the outcome may end up affecting both her and Joseph Duggar in the same way, regardless of how different their situations actually are. That's the risk of staying tied together in something this serious. But if anything shifts, if she separates legally, if she chooses a different path, if new information is brought forward, then everything changes, not just for her, but for the entire case. And that's why this situation feels so tense, even from the outside, because it's not just about what's already happened, it's about what hasn't happened yet. There's also something else that stands out when you think about how all of this has been handled. The effort it takes to keep everything aligned, to maintain a certain narrative, to make sure nothing breaks out of that structure, it's not small. That kind of coordination doesn't happen sluchina. It happens when there's something at stake that people don't want exposed or challenged. And that brings the focus back again to Jim Bob Duggar, because whether directly or indirectly, his presence is felt in almost every part of this situation.
from how things are being handled legally, to how the story is being presented publicly, to the overall direction everything seems to be moving in. It all points back to a central influence. And the question people keep coming back to is simple. Is this about protecting the family or protecting the truth from coming out? Because those are not the same thing. At the end of the day, though, there's one part of this that isn't complicated: the children. They're not part of the strategy, they're not part of the narrative, and they're not responsible for any of this, but they're the ones most affected by it. And in situations like this, the system eventually focuses on one core question: what environment is actually safe for them? Everything else, legal arguments, public perception, family loyalty, comes second to that. So no matter how controlled things may seem right now, no matter how carefully everything is being handled, there's always a point where the focus shifts back to what really matters. And when that happens, it's not about who managed the narrative better, it's about who made the choices that truly protected those children. And that's something no strategy can hide forever.